In the first 8 seconds, I want you to hear something most people never will. The sound a locked basement door makes when it opens for the first time in 190 years. Not a creak, not a groan, but a slow exhale, like something alive beneath the floorboards finally sensed freedom. You weren't supposed to hear that. You weren't meant to feel the weight of that breath. But now that you have, you'll never unhear it, and you'll never look at the land beneath your feet the same way again. Because in 1834, deep in the thinning woods outside Marshall County, Virginia, there was a family whose name still burns through archival pages like acid: the Sullivans. A line of people who lived quietly on the ridge, who owned little, who owed nothing, yet somehow wielded more influence in that small town than the judge, the sheriff, and the preacher combined. No one questioned why. No one dared. And when smoke stopped rising from their chimney one winter morning, the townspeople believed the Sullivans had finally left, slipped away in the night like a wandering clan returning to wherever ghosts go when they grow tired of flesh. But they didn't leave. They simply went silent. Silent long enough for vines to swallow their porch, for rain to rot their roof, for the earth itself to reject the house like an infection. When surveyors rediscovered the property nearly 2 centuries later, they thought they were stepping into a ruin. They did not expect the chains. They did not expect the hooks in the stone. And they did not expect the remains of 47 children arranged in patterns no sane mind could have designed. Patterns too precise, too intentional, too synchronized to dismiss as coincidence. This wasn't a basement. It was a system. A ritual. A machine built to break the spirit of the young and feed something older than the Sullivan bloodline. Something that didn't vanish when the house fell silent, but waited. Before we descend further, you need to understand something about families like the Sullivans. They didn't operate through brute force or open threat. They were architects of compliance, engineers of quiet obedience. People like them don't need guns to control a town. They use belief, tradition, shame. A look that lasts a second too long. A whispered warning no one admits to hearing. And in 1834, rural Virginia was fertile ground for that kind of power. The county records show almost nothing about them. No births, no deaths, no marriages. But their name appears in every dispute, every land disagreement, every whispered accusation. They were the kind of people who could walk into a room and drain the warmth from it, not through violence, but through presence. So when you hear the story of what was found in that basement, don't think of a family of monsters in the Hollywood sense. Think of a structure, an institution, designed to shape minds, bend wills, and carry out a purpose that stretched beyond simple cruelty. Because the Sullivan basement wasn't an accident. It was intentional. A place where childhood wasn't nurtured but harvested. Where identity wasn't formed but erased. Where silence wasn't punishment but doctrine. That old house sat at the center of a network of influence no paper trail can fully capture. But you can feel it, like a hum beneath the floorboards of history, a resonance that doesn't fade even when the truth gets buried. The Sullivan method, as investigators later called it, didn't end in that basement. It seeped into institutions, into schools, into places where control is exercised quietly and invisibly. And the deeper you go, the more you'll realize this wasn't a story about a family. It was a blueprint. A prototype of psychological control still mirrored today under different names, different uniforms, different missions. What was done to those children was only the beginning. What was learned from them shaped systems that still manipulate you without your knowledge. But to see it clearly, you must descend further. And descent always has a cost. When the basement was finally opened, the investigators didn't understand the markings carved into the stone. They assumed they were decorative, some old folk symbols carved by settlers to keep spirits away. But symbols don't repeat themselves with mathematical precision unless they're instructions. Unless they're part of a ritual architecture. One meant not for religious comfort but for psychological reprogramming. The Sullivans were not theologians. They were technicians of belief. They understood that if you want to control a child, you don't chain their body. You chain their perception. You fracture their sense of time until days blur into obedience. You distort language until words carry contradictions. You remove all mirrors until identity fades into a ghost. The remains found in that basement showed no signs of typical harm investigators expected. What they found instead were skeletal indicators of stress responses, spines curved from prolonged forced postures, wrists worn down not from pulling against chains but from repetitive movements, as though they had been trained to perform tasks endlessly, precisely, with no deviation. But here's what truly disturbed the forensic team. Every child's skull displayed subtle asymmetries, the kind that come from chronic sensory deprivation combined with rhythmic, controlled stimulation. This wasn't torture in the crude sense. This was conditioning. Refined. purposeful, scientific long before science had a name for it. And if this unsettles you, good. It means you're waking up to a truth most men never confront. Control doesn't always require violence. Sometimes it simply requires patterns. Repetition. Environments engineered to collapse the self and rebuild it into something compliant. Something useful. Something that serves a purpose larger than its own survival. That's what the Sullivan basement was. A place where the raw material of human identity was reshaped like molten iron. And once you understand how they did it, you'll start seeing the same methods in places you thought were safe. In institutions and cultural systems, in rules framed as for your own good. The Sullivan method didn't die. It evolved. By now, you might feel the air tightening as though some unseen weight is pressing on your chest. That's natural. When you confront forbidden history, your mind reacts like a guardian, trying to pull you back toward comfort. But comfort is the first layer of the cage. And if you want to see what the Sullivans really were, you need to push through that instinct. The journals found upstairs, not in the basement, but hidden behind warped floorboards in the attic, were written in a mixture of English and phonetic ciphers yet to be fully decoded. But the parts we can read paint a clearer picture than any sheriff's report. They reveal a belief that human potential wasn't something innate, but something extractable, refinable, transferable. The Sullivans wrote about the quiet ones, children selected from surrounding regions under vague circumstances, orphans, runaways, the unwanted, the miscounted. No records of adoption. No questions asked. And once inside the Sullivan house, the children were stripped of names, language, sequence. They were not taught to speak, they were taught to listen. They were not encouraged to imagine, they were conditioned to observe. And when a child broke psychologically, they weren't punished. They were recycled. The journal doesn't explain what that means. Investigators had theories, none of them comforting. But the most disturbing entry described something called the transfer. A ritual where the emotional burdens of the Sullivan adults were projected onto the children. Grief, rage, envy, fear. Negative states offloaded like luggage onto minds too young to resist. Imagine being a vessel for someone else's darkness. Not metaphorically, literally. Imagine inheriting trauma that isn't yours, carrying emotions you never earned, becoming the psychological landfill of another person's soul. That's what happened in that basement. And when you understand that, you understand why every institution built on power still reflects echoes of Sullivan doctrine. But stay with me. We're not done descending. Before we go deeper, before we reach the parts that alter something inside you permanently, I need something from you. A signal that you're not just listening, but transforming. Halfway through this journey, comment the symbolic phrase, "I descend beneath my former self." Write it twice. Not for superstition. Not for theatrics. But because ritual matters. Intention matters. Identity shifts when action and acknowledgement collide. Now, back to the truth. The Sullivans believed that children were conduits, unfinished vessels capable of absorbing more than adults. They viewed the human mind as a system of doors. Memory, obedience, instinct, loyalty. But the most guarded door, the one they obsessed over, was the door of will. Break a child's will and you gain a servant. But fracture it, shape the fragments, and you gain something else entirely. The basement wasn't just a chamber. It was a forge. Every chain placement corresponded to a journal diagram. Every hook aligned with acoustic patterns that created echoes engineered to disrupt sleep cycles. Every stone in the wall had been chosen for resonance, not strength. The children weren't merely restrained. They were immersed in a sensory algorithm, one designed to degrade the boundaries of selfhood. The Sullivan adults weren't just jailers. They were programmers. The children weren't victims. They were prototypes. Test subjects for an early form of psychological engineering later mirrored in schools, factories, orphanages, and military conditioning programs. You think these methods were invented in the 20th century? No. They were perfected in a basement in 1834 by a family who understood that the most obedient individual is not the one who fears punishment, but the one who believes obedience is his own idea. And that's the true horror. The Sullivans didn't vanish. Their methods were absorbed, sanitized, institutionalized, hidden behind better language, more polished walls. And every man who walks into this truth walks out changed. If he walks out at all. When investigators reconstructed the basement in digital models, something became immediately obvious. The room was designed around a pattern older than the house itself. A perfect spiral, subtle, almost hidden, traced through the architecture. Not carved, not drawn, embedded. The placement of stones, the contour of the floor, Even the angle of the staircase all pulled inward toward a central point, as though the house had been built around a concept rather than a blueprint. Spirals appear in ancient cultures, but not like this. This wasn't decorative. This was functional. The children's chains connected to anchor points along that spiral. Their positions formed a human circuitry, bodies arranged as conduits, nodes in a system of extraction. But extraction of what? That question haunted every expert who examined the site. You don't need to be spiritual to understand that human emotion has weight. You felt it. Walk into a room right after an argument and you can taste the tension. Enter a funeral home and you feel a heaviness that isn't on your shoulders but inside your lungs. The Sullivans learned how to weaponize that. One journal entry described the children as carriers of unspent force, and that chilling phrase sent researchers spiraling even further. Unspent force, raw emotional energy never expressed, never understood, never processed. Fear held in a child's mind becomes pressure. Grief becomes heat. Rage becomes static. Now imagine 47 children sharing that weight simultaneously, spiraling inward, feeding a point in the room that investigators still cannot explain. Because at the center of the basement floor was a depression, smooth, unnaturally symmetrical, as if countless bodies had knelt or collapsed there over generations. And when ground-penetrating scans were run beneath that center point, the machines malfunctioned. Not once. Every time. As though something under the floor rejected observation. As though the basement didn't just hold secrets, it buried them. And the deeper investigators dug, the more they realized. The Sullivan family didn't create the spiral. They inherited it. When the original foundation logs were located, historians made a disturbing discovery. The Sullivan house was the third structure built on that ridge. The first two homes burned down under unexplained circumstances. The first belonged to a widowed farmer whose journals described hearing voices under the floor at night, soft, rhythmic, as though a group of people were humming beneath the soil. His entries grew more frantic until they stopped abruptly in 1797. His house burned 3 days later, though no lightning struck and no ember trail was found. The second house belonged to a traveling midwife who settled on the ridge in 1811. She vanished after 5 years. The house burned down the same week. Neighbors claimed they saw green light pulsing from her windows the night before the fire, but no physical evidence survived. By the time the Sullivans arrived in the 1820s, the ridge already had a history, one of whispers, disappearances, and quiet fear. But instead of leaving, they stayed. Instead of fleeing from the strange hum beneath the earth, they embraced it. Their journals indicate that they believed the ridge was a thin place, a point where the barrier between consciousness and something older wears thin. Not demons. Not spirits. Something internal, something human but magnified grotesquely. A reservoir of emotional residue from centuries of suffering, trauma, and silence. The basement wasn't built over a void. It was built over a well. A well of unprocessed human emotion left behind by those who lived hard, died young, and were forgotten. The Sullivans saw power in that. They believed that children, with minds unguarded by adult rationalization, could tap into that well and amplify it. Not to control ghosts, but to shape the living. And if you think that sounds impossible, consider this. Every institution that shapes society, schools, churches, governments, already uses emotional architecture. Fear, guilt, aspiration, shame. Structure the environment and you structure the mind. The Sullivans simply went further. Too far. The most unsettling discovery in the attic journals was a sequence of observations written by the eldest Sullivan daughter, Alma. Her handwriting differed from the others, neater, sharper, more deliberate. She described the children not as captives, but as mirrors polished to reflect the hidden. Alma believed that when a child is stripped of identity, their mind becomes a lens through which deeper human truths can be observed, truths adults are too cluttered or conditioned to perceive. She wrote about experiments where the children were exposed to silence for days at a time, followed by sudden, overwhelming bursts of sound. Their reactions were recorded meticulously. Respiration changes, muscle twitches, instinctive gestures. Patterns emerged, patterns Alma believed revealed the subconscious architecture of the human mind. Her notes read like early versions of modern psychological experiments, yet written a century before such science existed. But Alma's most chilling entries described the blooming, a moment where certain children would suddenly speak in voices not their own. Not demonic possessions. Alma made that distinction clear. The children spoke truths about people they had never met. They described events that had not yet happened. They whispered fears so specific that adults in the room broke down in tears as though their hidden guilt had been exposed. Alma noted that every child who experienced the blooming died shortly after, yet she continued the experiments, continued the spiral, continued the rituals required to open the vessel, as she called it. Alma saw herself not as a torturer, but as a scientist of the unseen, a pioneer. The Sullivan basement in her mind wasn't a chamber of suffering, it was a laboratory for decoding the human soul. And that twisted justification is what makes her writing so dangerous. Because hidden in her madness is accuracy. She wasn't entirely wrong about how malleable the human mind is. Modern institutions prove that every day. When you understand the mindset of the Sullivans, you begin to understand why the town never intervened. People assume that evil must be loud, obvious, monstrous. It isn't. True power is quiet. True manipulation is subtle. The Sullivans were not feared because of violence, they were feared because of silence. They held no official positions, yet every authority figure deferred to them. The sheriff visited their home monthly. The preacher attended dinners there twice a year. And when children vanished from neighboring towns, the Sullivans were never questioned. Silence is a language, and the Sullivans spoke it fluently. You felt this too. The boss who never raises his voice yet controls the entire room. The institution that never states its true purpose yet shapes your every choice. The rules that no one writes down yet everyone obeys. That's how the Sullivans operated. Their influence wasn't supernatural, it was psychological. They understood a core truth. People would rather obey a quiet threat than confront a loud one. And the town obeyed. The children were taken from places where records were weak, where no one would challenge a disappearance. And those who suspected something learned quickly that suspicion carried a cost. Rumors of people going missing after speaking ill of the Sullivans go back decades. Those who returned never spoke again. That's how institutional power works today too. Not through force but through soft walls. Invisible cages. Social pressure. Fear of questioning. Fear of standing alone. The Sullivans did not invent these tactics. They mastered them. And when investigators uncovered letters exchanged between the Sullivans and certain unnamed officials in nearby counties, one thing became undeniable. The Sullivans were not acting alone. The letters found sealed inside the mantelpiece were written in careful script on parchment that had somehow survived the humidity of nearly 2 centuries. The correspondence was coded in metaphor, but the meaning was unmistakable. Someone of authority, someone outside the family, was providing the Sullivans with lists of names. Children marked with symbols. Children described as unclaimed, dispersed, withdrawn, quiet. The implication was horrifying. Institutions were feeding the Sullivan machine. Whether knowingly or unknowingly remains unclear, but the pipelines existed. And one name appeared repeatedly, an individual identified only by the initial H. Historians have speculated endlessly about who H was. Some believe he was a judge. Others suspect a traveling doctor who promoted unusual theories about cognitive development. A few propose something darker, an early government agent operating under directives we still do not understand. What matters is this: the Sullivans were never a rogue family. They were one arm of a much larger body, a prototype of organized psychological control. When the letters referenced the integration of subjects into broader systems, researchers realized with dread that the children who survived the basement, and there were survivors, were not freed. They were relocated, reassigned, absorbed into other institutions where obedience, silence, and compliance were valued traits. Schools, workhouses, churches, military camps. The methods refined in the Sullivan basement, sleep disruption, sensory manipulation, emotional erasure, began to appear in documents from other counties within 20 years. Coincidence? Impossible. The Sullivans were not the end. They were the beginning. A seed planted in the soil of the American psyche, watered by fear, nurtured by power, and harvested by those who understood that the easiest person to control is one who does not believe they are being controlled. What investigators found beneath the floorboards of the children's sleeping area forced them to stop the excavation for 2 days. Not because of danger, because of the implications. Hidden in small wooden boxes were artifacts belonging to the children, scraps of fabric, crude carvings, knots of hair wrapped in twine, and stones marked with tiny fingerprints. But each box also contained something else, a symbol carved with precision into a thin piece of slate. 47 slates, each with a distinct variation of the same emblem. A circle intersected by a vertical line, with branching lines resembling roots or veins. Some investigators thought it represented a tree. Others believed it represented the human nervous system. But Alma's journal offered the most chilling interpretation. She called the symbol the map of compliance. The design illustrated how human will fractures under stress. First identity breaks, then memory, then trust, then instinct, until finally the core self becomes susceptible to external imprinting. The children's symbols differed because each child broke differently. Each fracture pattern revealed how they could be controlled. Imagine having your trauma cataloged, mapped, weaponized against you. That's what the Sullivans did. They didn't just observe suffering, they systematized it. And once you see suffering as a tool rather than a tragedy, you can reshape an entire society with precision. That's what institutions do today. They map compliance. They know what breaks people. They know how to push just enough without snapping the mind fully. They learned this somewhere. And the earliest known blueprint sits in that basement, carved in slate by a girl who thought she was decoding humanity, while destroying her own. As the investigation deepened, one question kept resurfacing. Why 47 children? Why that specific number? It wasn't random. It wasn't based on opportunity. There was intention behind it. The journals revealed that the Sullivans believed 47 represented the full sequence of the human thresholds. They claimed there were thresholds of obedience, curiosity, fear, silence, endurance, despair, longing, mimicry, memory, and surrender, each threshold corresponding to a particular configuration of the mind under emotional stress. Alma believed that once all 47 thresholds were activated at the same time in a closed environment, a resonance would occur, what she called the opening of the collective gate. She described it as a moment when all children's minds functioned as a single organism, amplifying the emotional field until it became strong enough to induce external influence. Influence over what? That was the question investigators could never answer. Some theorists argue the Sullivans believed they could influence fate itself, bend circumstance, guide outcomes, shape community behavior. Others believe they sought something more internal, a way to cleanse their own emotional burdens using the children as psychic vessels. But one entry stands out. Alma wrote, "When the gate opens, the ridge will breathe again." Breathe. As if the land itself were alive. As if the earth beneath the house required emotional fuel. That sounds like superstition, until you realize that human psychology shapes human society, and human society shapes the world. The Sullivans didn't need magic. They needed pressure. Patterns. And if you think the number 47 has no significance, look deeper into modern psychological models. Thresholds, scales, stages, zones, levels of arousal, compliance, and adaptation. Many systems mirror the Sullivan model, even if no one ever admits where the earliest blueprint came from. Once the reconstruction team analyzed the acoustic properties of the basement, their findings exposed another layer of intent. The chamber wasn't silent. Not truly. The walls, floor, and ceiling produced a faint but persistent low-frequency hum when stimulated by movement, almost like the resonance of a distant engine. The Sullivans likely discovered this early on and used it to their advantage. Low-frequency vibrations affect the human body in ways most people never notice consciously. Increased heart rate, heightened anxiety, disrupted sleep, flashes of paranoia, and an instinctive sense of dread. Infrasound has been known to cause feelings of presence. Phantom touches, shadows at the edge of vision, the sense of being watched. The Sullivan basement amplified those effects naturally. The children, confined for weeks or months, would have lived in a perpetual state of heightened sensory vulnerability, so disoriented they could no longer distinguish internal fears from external realities. And when a child cannot trust their own senses, they surrender to the nearest authority figure out of pure survival instinct. The Sullivans engineered dependence. They engineered submission. Modern investigators realized the basement functioned like an early psychological pressure chamber. And when they compared the acoustic signatures of the basement to certain institutional facilities built decades later, detention centers, industrial schools, even some military training sites, the similarities were impossible to ignore. The frequencies were nearly identical. Coincidence? Not likely. The Sullivan method had been absorbed into the architecture of control. Just when investigators thought they had uncovered every horror the basement contained, they discovered a false wall behind the northern corner. It concealed a narrow passage that descended deeper into the hillside, carved manually through stone. The walls were smooth, almost polished by time, as if countless hands had brushed against them. At the end of the passage was a cavern no larger than a small room, a chamber that predated the Sullivan home by centuries. Charcoal deposits were dated to the 1600s. Tool marks indicated construction far older. And on the far wall, illuminated by the investigators' lamps, was a massive engraving unlike anything found elsewhere in the region. The spiral again. But this time it was perfect, precise, geometrically flawless. A symbol carved with such intent it seemed to pulse with meaning. Beneath it were dozens of smaller markings, similar to the children's slates but older, much older. The Sullivans hadn't invented the system. They had rediscovered it, adopted it, modernized it, perhaps even believed they were completing a ritual that had begun long before their bloodline existed. The cavern suggested that the ridge had been a place of emotional sacrifice or psychological experimentation for generations. Different cultures, different eras, same spiral. Same purpose, extraction, amplification, transformation. The Sullivans were merely the latest custodians of an older pattern, one that constantly reappears throughout history whenever power consolidates and identity is stripped away. One of the final journals uncovered, the one belonging to the Sullivan patriarch Elias, contained a revelation so disturbing that even seasoned investigators paused in disbelief. Elias wrote that the children were not meant to die. The goal was not destruction, it was conversion. He believed that once a child reached the final threshold, their consciousness would dissolve into alignment with the spiral, becoming something more than human emotion. He described a concept called the obedient field, a collective psychic residue that could be directed by those trained to control it. Elias saw the children as raw material for a force he intended to wield across the county, influencing decisions, shaping outcomes, softening resistance to the family's will. It sounds insane until you consider how influence works today. Not through blunt force but through emotional fields, trends, consensus, mood regulation, social direction. Elias believed he could manufacture such influence manually, through suffering. And in a monstrous way he wasn't wrong. People are programmable. Modern marketing proves that. Modern propaganda proves that. Elias Sullivan simply discovered an early horrific method of engineering mass compliance through concentrated emotional suffering. His final entry, shaky, incomplete, revealed his greatest fear: they will outlive us. The patterns. Once awakened, they move through minds without needing the ridge. If he was right, the Sullivan method didn't die with the fire. It metastasized. The fire that consumed the Sullivan home was not accidental. That much is now clear. Investigators found traces of lantern oil pooled in unnatural patterns, poured deliberately, not spilled. Local lore claims a storm rolled through that night, lightning striking the ridge, igniting the house. But weather records tell a different story. No lightning, no storm, no high winds. Just stillness, as if the land held its breath. Some theorists believe the townspeople finally acted, confronting the Sullivans in secret. But if that were true, where are the accounts? The confessions? The hints in personal diaries? Silence again. Too perfect. Too complete. More likely, the Sullivans burned their own home to erase evidence after something went wrong. Perhaps a threshold broke too far, or the children's collective suffering triggered a reaction they could not control. One letter from an unnamed neighbor mentioned a sound like 100 voices screaming without mouths, echoing across the ridge the night before the fire. Investigators dismissed it as hysteria or dramatic exaggeration, until audio experts reconstructed the basement acoustics and realized such an effect was theoretically possible under extreme conditions. If 47 children reached the breaking point simultaneously, if their minds aligned in the spiral, if the emotional field surged, something catastrophic could have happened. Something that frightened even the Sullivans. Something powerful enough to make them destroy their own creation. But burning wood doesn't erase ideas. Fire doesn't destroy methods. Trauma doesn't stay buried. It replicates. It migrates. And over time, it hides behind new names. When the ridge was finally declared safe for redevelopment in the early 2000s, a small construction company purchased the land. Their project lasted 3 days. Workers reported nausea, vertigo, migraines, and overwhelming emotional surges, anger, sorrow, panic, whenever they approached the old foundation. Animals refused to enter the area. Compasses malfunctioned. The company withdrew, filing no formal explanation. They simply left. The county sealed the ridge again. But history has a way of circling back, just like the spiral. Researchers comparing modern institutional practices with the Sullivan journals noticed disturbing parallels. Deprivation cycles, sensory manipulation, emotional flooding, dependency creation, compliance mapping, ritualized silence. The architecture changes. The uniforms change. The language evolves. But the core remains the same. Control the emotional field and you control the human being. The Sullivan basement was not an anomaly. It was a prototype. A missing chapter in the evolution of psychological influence. And once you've seen this truth, Once you've heard the ridge breathe, you can't go back to sleep. You start noticing the spirals everywhere. In routines, in systems, in the invisible pressures shaping your decisions. Most people never see them. You do now. And that awareness is not a gift. It's a responsibility. Because once you recognize the architecture of control, you face a question the Sullivans never wanted you to ask. If the patterns survived, who's using them today? The sound returned first, the soft, rhythmic tapping that had begun in the previous night, like fingernails drumming behind a thin wall. At first it came faintly, as though the house itself was waking before the people inside ever opened their eyes. But then, as the gray light of morning crept through the warped window panes, the tapping grew louder, setting a slow, unnerving tempo across the Sullivan homestead. Every surface seemed to pick up the vibration. Plates in the cupboard trembled. The bed frame gave a slight shake. Even the dust floating in the air appeared to move in time with a pulse that belonged to something unseen. Thomas was the first to sit up, clutching his blanket with the expression of someone who had just remembered a nightmare but realized it was still happening. His mother, Ellen, stood in the doorway, her face drained of color, her eyes fixed not on him but on the wall behind him, as though the tapping came from inside it. She whispered his name only once, but her voice cracked in the middle, splitting the syllables like a confession. Downstairs, Henry Sullivan paced the length of the kitchen, muttering to himself, insisting that the noises meant nothing, that old timber creaked in cold weather, that animals nested in walls, that wind did strange things this time of year. But his words lacked conviction, and every time the tapping halted for a brief moment, he froze as if bracing for what might follow. When the sound finally stopped altogether, silence fell with the weight of something deliberate. Thomas crept down the stairs, drawn by a feeling he could not explain, a pull as real as a hand gripping his collar. On the kitchen table lay the family's old ledger, its cover cracked, its pages yellowed. No one remembered placing it there. No one had opened it in years. Yet now it lay directly in the center of the table, open to a page that bore no handwriting they recognized. The ink was dark, fresh, glistening as though it had been written moments before. At the top of the page was a single sentence. The house remembers what the living choose to forget. Henry slammed the ledger shut, but Thomas could not shake the sensation that something in the room smiled when he did. Later that afternoon, the air carried an electric heaviness, the kind that appears before a storm yet without clouds, thunder, or any sign of skyborne violence. Thomas stayed near the windows, watching the fields beyond the property line, sensing that the world outside had grown smaller, as though the boundaries of the land were creeping inward. The trees appeared closer than they had in the morning, and the old well near the barn seemed to lean at an angle that defied how it stood the day before. Ellen tried to distract herself with chores, but her hands trembled too much to finish even the simplest task. She kept glancing toward the cellar door, which remained latched but appeared to breathe subtly, swelling inward and outward in slow, unnatural cycles. By dusk, Henry had convinced himself that the ledger's appearance was a prank played by one of the older children, though none admitted to it, and the ink's strange texture suggested otherwise. Still, denial was easier than admitting that the past was not only alive but moving. When Thomas walked into the parlor, he felt a shift in temperature, a sudden pocket of cold that clung to him like wet cloth. In the far corner, where the shadows gathered thickest, he noticed something new, a faint outline on the wall, not drawn but etched by pressure, as though hands had pressed from the other side. The marks were subtle yet unmistakably human. Ellen gasped when she saw them, recognizing the shape instantly, the height, the curve of the fingers, the narrow spacing. The same handprints had once appeared outside Thomas's window when he was a toddler. The family blamed neighborhood children then. But the prints had been too high, too symmetrical, too deliberate. Before anyone could speak, the tapping resumed, but this time it came not from behind the walls but above, from the attic, directly over their heads. The sound was heavier now, purposeful, like slow footsteps pacing in a tight circle. Henry reached for the lantern, tightening his grip as though the handle might dissolve. As he took his first step toward the attic ladder, the tapping stopped. And then, in that unnerving quiet, a floorboard above them groaned under the weight of something that was no longer content to remain unseen. Henry insisted on checking the attic alone, but Thomas followed him despite the sharp command to stay downstairs. The ladder creaked under Henry's weight, each rung producing a hollow sound, as if the wood remembered the footsteps of others who had climbed it long before him. When he reached the top, he paused, lantern raised, its glow struggling to cut through the murk. Thomas stood below, gripping the ladder's sides, feeling the air grow colder by the second. The attic had always been cramped and dusty, filled with trunks of old clothing, broken tools, and relics from relatives the family barely remembered. But now it felt altered, wider, emptier, as though someone had cleared space in the middle of the room. Henry stepped forward slowly, his boots crunching over debris. Thomas could hear his father's breathing, shallow, uneven, betraying nerves he refused to acknowledge. "Nothing up here," Henry called down, but his voice lacked confidence. Thomas climbed halfway up the ladder, peering into the gloom. His eyes adjusted enough to see faint drag marks on the floorboards, circling the attic center. Something had moved recently. Something large enough to leave grooves. Henry edged closer, lantern held out in front of him. The flame flickered violently, dimming, then brightening, as though reacting to a presence rather than the draft. Then Thomas heard it, soft at first like fabric brushing wood. But it grew louder, unmistakably real, a sliding sound coming from behind an old trunk near the far wall. Henry swallowed hard. He approached the trunk with caution, knees bent slightly, lantern trembling. As he reached the edge and leaned forward, the sliding sound stopped. A new sound replaced it, a single breath, long and rattling, exhaled from somewhere impossibly close. Henry stumbled back and the lantern slipped from his hand, crashing onto the floor. The flame dimmed but did not die. Instead, it cast a trembling light across the floorboards, revealing something that made Thomas freeze. Two impressions rested in the dust, bare human feet pointed toward them, the toes pressed deep as if someone stood there only moments before. But the dust around the impressions was undisturbed. No footprints led to them. No footprints led away. Henry scrambled down the ladder, pushing past Thomas with a force that nearly knocked the boy to the ground. His face had drained of all color, and his chest heaved as he struggled to regain control of his breath. Ellen rushed toward them, hands shaking, demanding an explanation. Henry offered none. Instead, he grabbed a hammer from the tool shelf and slammed the attic hatch shut, driving nails into the wood until the metal bent and the frame splintered. His movements were frantic, unmeasured, betraying a terror he refused to name. The children watched in silence as each blow echoed through the house like a warning. When Henry finished, he wiped his forehead with trembling fingers and turned to the family, insisting that no one go near the attic again. Thomas tried to speak, to explain what he had seen, but the words caught in his throat. It wasn't fear that silenced him, it was the certainty that the attic wasn't the problem. The footsteps, the tapping, the breath, they were symptoms, not the source. That night, the family gathered in the parlor, lanterns lit, curtains drawn. The atmosphere felt suffocating, as though the air carried weight. The house groaned occasionally, wood bending in slow, unnatural ways that did not match the wind outside. Ellen read from an old family Bible, hoping the sound of scripture would settle the tension, but even her steady voice trembled. The younger children whispered questions Thomas couldn't answer. What had been in the attic? Why had it stood so still? Why had the dust remained untouched except for the footprints? Hours passed before anyone attempted sleep. Henry remained awake, pacing near the front door, hammer still in hand. Thomas lay on the sofa, staring at the ceiling. Every so often he imagined he heard faint creaks above him, soft as breathing. But the attic hatch remained silent. Just when exhaustion began to overtake him, he felt the cushion beneath him dip slightly, as though someone had sat down at the edge of the sofa. His eyes snapped open. No one was there. The lantern flickered once, twice, then steadied. Thomas remained still, trying to convince himself that his imagination had played a cruel trick. But when he turned his head, he saw a new detail in the dust on the floor, a trail of faint, child-sized footprints leading from the parlor doorway toward where he lay. The footprints stopped just inches from Thomas's head, their delicate shape unmistakably belonging to a small child. Yet the younger children were all asleep upstairs, and none had come down the stairs without being heard. Thomas sat up slowly, every movement careful, as though sudden motion might invite whatever left the prints to reveal itself. He called softly for Henry, his voice barely above a whisper. His father's footsteps echoed down the hallway, heavy and urgent. When Henry entered the room and saw the prints, his expression shifted from fear to something darker, recognition. He knelt beside them, tracing the outline with the blunt end of the hammer. His hand shook. Ellen arrived moments later, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't ask whose footprints they were. She already knew. They resembled the prints of a child who had lived in the house generations earlier, a child whose name had been scratched out of the family ledger long ago, replaced by a series of ink-blotted smears. The house had whispered stories about that child for decades, stories of sickness, isolation, and a disappearance that elders insisted was peaceful, though the few surviving letters suggested otherwise. Ellen forced the children back upstairs, herding them like fragile animals toward safety. Thomas remained with Henry in the parlor, both staring at the footprints. The lantern's flame dimmed and brightened again, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally across the walls. Henry whispered something Thomas almost didn't hear. "I thought it was done. I thought they stayed buried." Before Thomas could ask what he meant, a hollow knock echoed against the front door, slow, deliberate, chilling. Another followed, heavier, vibrating the hinges. Henry stepped back, gripping the hammer until his knuckles whitened. The knocking grew louder, not urgent but patient, as though whoever, or whatever, stood outside knew the family had no intention of opening the door. Eventually the knocking stopped. Silence stretched through the room like an invisible fog. Henry took a cautious step forward and placed his ear to the door. He listened for several seconds. Then his face twisted in horror. He yanked Thomas away from the entry just as a voice whispered through the wood, soft, childlike, and painfully familiar. "Let me in. I've been waiting." Henry dragged Thomas backward, stumbling into the parlor as the voice repeated the plea, "Let me in." Each repetition grew softer, more strained, as though the speaker pressed their mouth directly against the wooden door. The lantern flickered wildly, the flame bending sideways, reacting to a draft that did not exist. Ellen rushed back down the stairs, panic etched across her face. She clutched a rusted iron key, an heirloom passed down through generations, rumored to lock away the oldest secrets of the Sullivan line. Her breath shook as she pressed the key into Henry's hand. "It's starting again," she whispered. "We have to seal the threshold." Henry hesitated, torn between disbelief and the instinct to protect his family. The voice behind the door grew faint, almost mournful, as though whoever spoke realized the family was resisting. Thomas felt a tug in his chest, an inexplicable pull toward the door, an urge to open it, not out of curiosity but out of recognition. Something about the voice felt familiar, resonant, anchored in memory he did not know he possessed. Henry fit the key into the lock, turning it until the mechanism clicked. A deep vibration traveled through the wood, faint but perceptible like a pulse. The voice fell silent. The air grew heavy again, suffocating the room with dread. Then, without warning, the entire house shuddered violently. The walls creaked. The floorboards trembled. Dust cascaded from the ceiling like falling ash. A sound erupted from the cellar, an inhuman groan, long and resonant, as if an ancient door had been forced open in the depths beneath them. Ellen gasped, clutching her chest. "It's not at the door anymore," she whispered. The cellar door rattled once, loudly enough to silence every breath in the room. Then it rattled again, harder, the latch straining as though something pushed from the other side. Henry raised the hammer. Thomas backed away, his heart pounding. The rattling ceased abruptly. In its place came a scraping sound, something dragging slowly across the cellar floor, approaching the stairs. Step by step, the unseen thing climbed. The final sound before silence fell was unmistakable, a soft, childish giggle drifting up from the darkness. The cellar door burst inward, not violently but with slow, steady pressure, as though a small hand pushed it open with deliberate intent. The hinges wailed, metal grinding against metal, and cold air spilled into the parlor like a physical presence. Lanterns dimmed to near darkness, their flames shrinking as though suffocated. Henry positioned himself between the door and his family, hammer raised, though his trembling arm betrayed his fear. Thomas stared into the cellar's yawning mouth, the darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the lantern light. Then he saw it, a faint silhouette at the base of the stairs, no taller than a child, standing perfectly still. Its outline wavered, as though its form struggled to remain anchored to the world. The figure took a step upward. The wood groaned beneath its weight, but the sound was wrong, delayed, distorted, echoing as though recorded elsewhere and played back at the wrong speed. Ellen whispered a prayer, but the words dissolved in her throat. The figure climbed slowly, each step more defined than the last, until it reached the top of the staircase. Lantern light flickered across its shape but revealed no features, only the suggestion of a small body, arms slightly outstretched. Then it spoke. Its voice was soft and curious, like a child discovering something for the first time. "Why did you lock me out?" Henry stepped forward instinctively, though fear shattered his composure. "You're not supposed to be here," he muttered. The figure tilted its head as if confused. "But I never left," it replied. "You forgot me." Thomas felt the words cut through him with eerie familiarity. He took a step toward the figure before Ellen grabbed his arm, pulling him back. The figure's head snapped toward her, movements too sharp, too sudden, like a puppet jerked by invisible strings. The room grew colder still. Frost crawled up the walls, forming thin, jagged veins across the wood. The figure raised one hand, palm open, revealing a dark smudge where fingers should be, an ink blot identical to the one in the ledger. "You erased me," it whispered. "But the house remembers." And with that, every lantern in the room went out at once. Darkness swallowed the room the instant the lanterns died, thick and absolute, leaving the family suspended in a void where even breath felt too loud. Thomas blinked frantically, but his eyes found nothing. No outlines, no shapes, not even the faint glow of dying embers. Only the cold remained, creeping across his skin like invisible fingers. Somewhere in the blackness, Henry exhaled sharply and swung the hammer through the air, striking nothing but emptiness. The metallic ring echoed unnaturally, as though the room had expanded to cavernous dimensions in the dark. Ellen fumbled along the wall for a match, her hands shaking so violently that each wooden stick snapped before she could strike it. The scent of sulfur burned the air, but no flame followed. "Stay together," Henry whispered, but his voice sounded farther away than he should have been. Thomas reached out blindly, searching for his father's sleeve, but his fingertips brushed only cold air. Then the childlike voice drifted through the dark again, closer now, almost next to his ear. "You shouldn't hide from me." Thomas jerked away instinctively, and his shoulder struck something solid, something warm. He reached upward, expecting to find a person's arm or chest, but instead his hand sank slightly, as though pressing against damp cloth stretched over something hollow. A tremor of dread shot through him. The figure in the cellar had moved, but not with footsteps. It seemed to glide. Ellen finally managed to strike a match with shaking precision. A tiny flame sputtered to life, trembling in the cold air. In that brief illumination, the room appeared warped. The walls bowed outward, the ceiling stretched high above, and every shadow trembled as if alive. But what froze Thomas was the sight directly in front of him. The small figure standing inches away, motionless, its head tilted, its ink-blot hand raised as though reaching to touch his cheek. Its face remained obscured, not by shadows but by something else, an absence shaped like a child's face. The match burned Ellen's fingers and the flame died with a hiss. Darkness surged back like a tide. Then the voice whispered once more, this time behind all of them, "You forgot my name. But I know yours." The darkness shifted. Not like the slow drift of shadow but like something moving through it, something brushing against the walls, the floorboards, the ceiling beams. The Sullivan family huddled close, though none could see the others. Even breathing became dangerous, each inhale too loud, each exhale echoing in ways that weren't natural. Thomas felt a presence circle him, brushing past him with an icy hum, sending a tremor up his spine. The voice returned, not a whisper now, but a murmur that rippled from multiple directions at once. "Do you hear it?" it asked gently. "The house is remembering." A distant creak answered, emanating from the upper floor. Then another, heavier, as if someone walked across the room directly above them. Footsteps, calm, deliberate, pacing with familiarity. The attic was sealed shut, but the steps came anyway. Ellen clutched her children tightly, whispering prayers that dissolved into nervous breaths. Henry raised his hammer, though he swung blindly into the dark, striking the air with desperation. When the footsteps stopped, the silence grew oppressive, thick enough to make Thomas's ears ring. Then came a new sound, the soft tearing of paper. The ledger. It lay somewhere in the room, though no one had touched it since Henry slammed it shut. The tearing continued, slow, methodical, like fragile pages being peeled apart. Thomas heard the faint flutter of loose sheets falling to the floor. The figure's voice drifted downward as if descending from the ceiling beams. "You tried to bury the truth," it crooned. "But truth doesn't rot." Henry roared into the blackness, swinging the hammer violently. His blow connected with something soft. A sharp cry filled the room, childlike yet distorted, its tone stretched unnaturally. Thomas recoiled, unsure whether the sound came from the figure or from something deeper within the house. The lanterns suddenly ignited on their own, flames bursting upward in tall, unnatural plumes. The room flooded with flickering light. And there, standing by the hearth, was the figure, fully visible now. Its body was that of a child, barefoot, in tattered nightclothes. But its face remained a hollow void, an empty space where features should have been, surrounded by smudges of ink that seemed to pulse like living veins. It lifted its hand toward Henry. "You hit me," it said softly. "Just like before." Henry staggered backward, gripping the hammer with both hands as though anchoring himself to reality. The figure advanced, not with steps but with a quiet drifting motion, its body swaying as though suspended in water. The ink around its absent face thickened, swirling like smoke trapped under glass. "I didn't hit you," Henry stammered. It can't be you." The figure paused, tilting its head with unbearable slowness. "You don't remember," it said. "But the house does." Ellen stepped forward, her fear momentarily eclipsed by the instinct to protect her children. "What do you want?" she asked, voice cracking. The figure turned toward her. For the first time, the ink surrounding its form pulsed brightly, illuminating the edges of a shape hidden within the void of its face. "To be seen," it answered. "To be named." Before anyone could react, the room shuddered violently. Floorboards rippled as though something massive moved beneath them. The walls throbbed with a heartbeat not belonging to any living creature. The lantern flames twisted into spiraling columns, bending toward the child-shaped void as if drawn by a gravitational pull. Thomas felt something inside his mind shift, a strange, invasive pressure pressing against the edges of his memory. Images flickered behind his eyes, faces he didn't know, voices calling through time, a dimly lit room filled with children chained in a row, their eyes hollow, their bodies frail. A hand, not his own, reached out to them. A key turned in a lock. A scream. Thomas collapsed to his knees, gasping as the visions dissolved. Ellen rushed to him, cradling his shoulders. The figure, if one could still call it that, drifted closer. Its presence felt heavier now, as though it carried the weight of dozens of unspoken stories. "You saw them," it whispered. "You saw what they were made to forget." Henry lunged forward, swinging the hammer directly at the void's head. But the hammer passed through the figure as though through smoke. The ink pulsed, expanding outward in a ripple that extinguished every lantern at once. Darkness swallowed the room again. But this time the figure's voice echoed from everywhere at once. "You erased 47 names," it murmured. "But I kept one." The darkness felt different now, dense, suffocating, almost liquid. Thomas struggled to breathe, gasping as though invisible hands pressed against his chest. Ellen held him close, her heartbeat a frantic tremor beneath her ribs. Henry stumbled blindly through the room, calling out their names, each shout swallowed by the heavy dark. Then a faint glow appeared near the floor, small, flickering, like a candle struggling to hold itself together. It illuminated only a few inches around it, but even that was enough to reveal something horrifying. The cellar door had fully opened again. And beyond it, the stairs were lined with shapes, small, unmoving shapes. Children. Dozens of them. Their forms flickered like candlelight, fading in and out of visibility. Some leaned against the walls. Others sat with their heads bowed. A few stared upward with glassy, hollow eyes. None spoke. None moved. The figure in the center of the parlor whispered, "Do you see them now?" Henry cursed, backing away as the ghostly shapes crept into the room. Their movements were jerky, fragmented, as though time lagged around them. Thomas trembled violently. His earlier visions now aligned with what stood before him. These were the children of the Sullivan ledger. The ones erased. The ones forgotten. The ones the house remembered. Ellen clutched her children tighter, but it was clear protection no longer existed here. The house exhaled, a long rattling sigh that shook dust from the rafters. The children turned their hollow gazes toward Thomas, then toward Henry. The ink-faced figure stepped forward. "He remembers," it said, pointing at Thomas. "But you," it turned toward Henry, "you hid the truth because you feared what they would become." Henry shouted, "It wasn't me. It wasn't my generation. I didn't do this." The figure's head tilted. History doesn't care which hands held the chains. Only which lineage built the cellar. The ghostly children began moving closer, surrounding the family. Their hollow faces flickered, their small hands stretching outward. Thomas felt an overwhelming pressure in his skull, an urgency, a command that wasn't spoken but embedded in the air. The figure whispered to him, "The truth demands a witness." And then for the first time it spoke a name, one Thomas recognized but could not place. A name that made Henry collapse to the ground. Henry gasped as if struck by a physical blow. The name the figure had uttered, one he had forbidden from the family's history, rattled through the house like a bell. Thomas watched his father crumble, clutching his head, breathing in panicked bursts. The ghostly children surrounded him, forming a silent circle. Their hollow eyes seemed to drink in his fear. "Stop," Ellen pleaded, stepping between Henry and the encroaching ring of spectral forms. But her voice passed through them unheeded. The ink-faced figure drifted closer, its small form pulsing with unnatural energy. "He hid us," it said, its tone heartbreakingly calm. "He buried us. He denied what was done in his name." Henry's voice cracked as he crawled backward. "I didn't chain anyone," he whispered. "I didn't, but your blood did," the figure replied. And blood remembers. Thomas felt the pressure in his mind intensify, as though something inside him was being pulled open. Memories that weren't his own bled through. A man with Sullivan features carrying a lantern into the old cellar, the cries of children echoing in the stone chamber, a ledger signed with the family seal, a locked door, footsteps walking away. Thomas clutched his head, trying to force the images out. But they kept coming, more vivid, more detailed, more damning. The ghostly children began humming, a low, dissonant tone that vibrated through the floorboards. The ink-faced figure raised its hand. He must speak the truth, it declared. The humming grew louder. Shadows twisted across the walls, forming shapes that resembled chains wrapping around beams, around corners, around Henry's ankles. Henry screamed as invisible force pulled him forward, dragging him toward the open cellar door. Ellen and Thomas lunged toward him, but a wave of cold air blasted them backward, slamming them against the far wall. The ghostly children parted, creating a narrow path leading directly into the cellar's abyss. Henry's voice broke. "Please," he begged. "Please don't take me down there." The figure hovered above the threshold. "Then speak," it demanded. "Speak the truth of Sullivan blood." Henry trembled, shaking so violently he could barely form words. And Thomas realized this was only the beginning. Because the house wasn't demanding punishment. It was demanding confession. Henry's voice cracked the moment he tried to speak. The air around him thickened, pressing inward like a closing fist. The ghostly children leaned forward, their hollow eyes fixed on him, their humming deepening into a slow, resonant vibration. Thomas felt the sound inside his bones, rattling his teeth, compressing his lungs. The ink-faced figure hovered just above the cellar threshold, its outline twitching like a flame struggling against wind. "Speak it," it commanded, each word echoing unnaturally. Henry swallowed hard, sweat pouring down his face. "My family," he began. The humming intensified. My family kept children." The ghostly forms flickered violently, as if absorbing each word. "They were orphans, runaways, the poor, the forgotten." The air trembled with rising tension. Thomas felt his heart hammering painfully. He wasn't sure the figure wanted a confession. It wanted revelation. Henry's shoulders shook. "They chained them. Used them." Ellen's sob broke through the thick silence. Henry's voice dropped to a shivering whisper. "Experimented on them." The room trembled. The lantern flames stretched upward like spines of fire. The ink-faced figure leaned closer. "Why?" Henry shut his eyes as if willing himself to disappear. "Because they believed," he whispered, "that suffering revealed the soul." A collective shiver passed through the ghostly children. The ink around the figure's void face churned violently. It spoke, and what did they learn? Henry sobbed. "Nothing. They only learned how to kill." Silence. A crushing, suffocating silence. Then the figure extended its ink-smeared hand toward Thomas. "You," it whispered, "are the witness." Thomas felt something shift inside him. An awakening, a tearing open of perception. A voice in his mind, not the figure's, not his own, whispered, "If you have descended this far, comment the phrase, 'The house remembers me twice.'" The ink-faced child continued, "If you speak the truth aloud, you inherit it. If you deny it, the house will decide your fate." The cellar door beneath it widened, no longer stairs descending into a basement, but a black chasm opening like a mouth. Henry screamed as the invisible force tightened around his ankles. Thomas stepped forward, compelled by something deeper than fear, something ancient whispering in his veins. The figure turned toward him. "Now," it said. "Say the name." The sound reached Caldwell before the meaning did, an irregular metallic tapping, faint but deliberate, as if something below the earth was knocking upward with a patience that suggested it had been waiting for years. He froze in the corridor carved from the bedrock of the abandoned settlement, lantern trembling in his grip. Dust sifted from the ceiling with each tap, creating a thin ghostly haze that hovered around him like breath on a winter morning. The air was colder than the rest of the tunnels, colder than anything this deep should have been. He whispered for Elias and Mara, but neither answered, swallowed instead by the tunnel's wider silence. The tapping stopped, then resumed, 3 knocks, a pause, then 2, repeating, insistent, intelligent. Caldwell remembered the journal he had found earlier that night, 1 page describing those exact knocks. The author wrote that they were not warnings but invitations, coded summons from something sealed away long before any of them arrived. The lantern flickered, shrinking shadows into long, distorted limbs that stretched along the stone floor. A smell rose with them, faintly metallic, like old blood exposed to open air. Caldwell felt the strange pressure again behind his eyes, the creeping suggestion that these tunnels were not abandoned but waiting, that the settlement above had never been deserted but merely emptied. He stepped forward despite knowing he shouldn't, drawn by the way the knocks seemed to echo inside his skull instead of the tunnel. His foot brushed against something soft. He looked down, expecting debris, then realized it was the shredded sleeve of Elias's coat, torn cleanly at the seam, no blood, no body, just the fabric lying like a shed skin. The taps grew louder. 3 paws 2. 3 paws 2. The cadence burrowed under his thoughts until it felt like it was controlling his breathing, matching the rising and falling of his chest. Caldwell pressed himself against the wall, heart hammering so violently it made the lantern glass shake. He tried to call out again but produced only a dry rasp. The tunnel shifted, a low groan reverberating through the stone. Then, finally, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse because he realized he now heard something else. Something breathing. Not ahead. Not behind. Above, just inches above, on the other side of the thinning stone. The ceiling dust sifted down in a steady rain as Caldwell backed away, every muscle in his body tight enough to snap. He couldn't pinpoint the breathing anymore. It was everywhere, as if the entire tunnel inhaled with him and exhaled on its own. He felt the vibration of it through his boots, a slow, rhythmic pulse like the heartbeat of something vast buried beneath the earth. His lantern gave a soft pop and dimmed to half its strength, its flame guttering but not entirely dying. He forced himself to breathe shallowly, terrified his own breaths would drown out whatever sound warned him of what came next. He whispered Mara's name, barely moving his lips, hoping she might somehow hear him if she still lived. But the only reply was a faint dragging sound from farther down the tunnel, a slow scrape as though fingertips were pulling across stone. Caldwell pressed his back to the wall again, wishing for the first time he had never accepted the expedition's invitation, never followed Elias into these cursed remains of the settlement the locals called Hollow's Rest. Elias had insisted the stories were exaggerated myths, superstitions of miners who didn't understand what they'd found. But Caldwell had read the older texts, the pre-settlement records, the ones that spoke of an older colony here long before the town was founded. People who vanished without a trace, leaving only these tunnels and their warnings behind. The dragging sound grew louder, closer, and Caldwell realized with horror that whatever made the noise dragged more than one set of fingers. It sounded like dozens moving in sync. He stumbled backward until his heel struck something solid. Panic seized him until he realized it was a wooden crate, half-rotten, stamped with the same strange sigil they had found near the entrance. A circle bisected by 3 lines, the exact pattern the knocks had repeated. Caldwell knelt and clawed the lid open. Inside lay maps, old and brittle, covered in notes written in Elias's handwriting, but dated long before Elias was born. Caldwell blinked at the impossible ink, his pulse thundering in his ears. The dragging stopped abruptly. Then something tapped the ground right beside his foot, once, twice, slowly, as if whatever lurked in the dark had found him and was gently letting him know. Caldwell lurched upright, kicking the crate aside as he stumbled deeper into the tunnel, desperate to escape the unseen presence now only steps away. The tapping followed, sharp and deliberate, echoing off the narrow stone walls like skeletal knuckles trailing behind him. His lantern flickered violently, casting warped shadows that crawled along the floor as if trying to catch him first. He didn't dare look back. He knew instinctively that if he did, he would freeze, and whatever hunted him would close the small distance between them with terrifying ease. He forced himself into a sprint, lungs burning, boots slamming against the uneven ground. The tunnel widened ahead into an open chamber, the same one Elias had insisted they explore at sunrise, an idea Caldwell had foolishly dismissed as overcautious. Now he understood the fear behind Elias's warning. The chamber pulsed with an icy draft, though no entrance existed to let in air. Strange marks covered the walls, deep clawed grooves forming spirals that bled into one another, converging into a single circular pattern carved into the floor. That same bisected symbol. Caldwell stumbled into the chamber's center, immediately wishing he hadn't. The air thickened with a low-frequency hum that vibrated inside his bones, making his joints ache. He felt something shift beneath his boots, a subtle movement like the shiver of muscles beneath skin. The stone floor wasn't stone at all, not entirely. He backed away, but the hum deepened, rising into an audible tremor that filled the chamber. Slowly, impossibly, the circular carving began to rotate, grinding against itself like massive interlocking plates. He heard the tunnel behind him tremble as the tapping stopped abruptly. Silence. Then a voice, soft, genderless, impossibly close, whispered his name. Caldwell spun toward the tunnel, expecting Mara or Elias or anything recognizable. But the tunnel was empty, swallowed in shadow. The whisper came again, closer, curling into his ear like a breath. This time it wasn't a voice he knew. It was layered, ancient, whispering through multiple tones as if several mouths spoke in unison from the same unseen shape. Caldwell staggered back toward the rotating symbol, pulse pounding, torn between terror and the instinct that standing still would be worse. He saw movement in the tunnel at last, shapes emerging, tall and thin, bending where joints should not bend. And as they stepped fully into view, the floor behind him opened like an eye beginning to wake. The chamber split itself open like something organic forced into stone, the rotating circle peeling apart in slow, grinding layers. Caldwell staggered back from the widening gap, shielding his face from the sudden burst of heat that rose from below. Heat tinged with the unmistakable stench of rot. The tall, thin figures emerging from the tunnel paused at the chamber threshold, their movements synchronized, their frames bending in unnatural arcs as though they were studying him, measuring the precise moment to advance. Caldwell backed toward the edge, torn between two terrors, the shapes before him and the unknown beneath. The gap continued to expand until he could see stairs hewn into the drop, spiraling down into a pulsing red glow far below. The heat intensified, thickening the air until it felt like he was breathing someone else's exhale. The layered voice whispered his name again, this time from below, not behind. Caldwell knew the much older journal had warned of a second descent, a place where the original settlers had vanished after following the same voice. He also remembered the warning scribbled at the edges of that same page. Do not let them touch you. Do not let them see you choose. The figures stepped forward, their elongated limbs scraping lightly along the stone as they entered the chamber. Their heads tilted in unison. Caldwell realized they had no eyes, only long, smooth faces with thin slits where mouths might once have been. They raised their arms, impossibly long, jointed wrong, reaching toward him with a strange, gentle slowness that terrified him more than aggression. He took a step backward onto the top stair, and the reaction was immediate. The figures froze, heads snapping toward the opening below as if waiting for permission. A low rumble answered, vibrating up the stairwell. Caldwell felt it through the soles of his boots, a heartbeat, massive and patient. Then the voice returned, no longer whispering. This time it filled the chamber like a commandment, descend. Caldwell didn't know why, but something in that tone reached into the oldest part of him, the instinct poisoned by fear and curiosity in equal measure. He glanced back at the faceless things approaching him. Their arms stretched further, fingertips grazing the air inches from his chest. He made his decision not by logic but by a primal pull he couldn't resist. He took the first step downward. And when he did, the chamber exhaled. The stairwell swallowed him in a heat so intense it felt like walking into the lungs of something alive. The voice continued its rhythmic whisper, no longer calling his name but speaking in layered syllables he couldn't interpret, yet somehow understood emotionally. It was the language of coercion, the cadence of something that had mastered the art of bending minds long before humans crawled across the continent. Caldwell descended slowly, each step vibrating with that deep subterranean heartbeat. The stone walls pulsed with faint reddish veins that brightened as he passed, casting a dim glow that revealed carvings far older than the settlement above. Figures etched into the walls showed tall beings bending over kneeling humans, hands pressed to their skulls, streams of light, or thought, flowing from one to the other. Caldwell reached out and traced the carvings with shaking fingers. They weren't chiseled. They were melted. A sound rose from below, a wet dragging, like something massive shifting its weight across slick stone. The stairwell widened suddenly into a cavern so large Caldwell felt his breath catch. The air was thick, damp, and alive with movement, tiny motes drifting upward like ash, turning as though reacting to his presence. In the cavern's center lay a pool of viscous black fluid that reflected the red glow from above. As Caldwell moved closer, the surface rippled. A shape began to rise from the center. Slowly, with purpose, dripping shadows with each movement. Caldwell staggered back, but the stairwell behind him had sealed shut. Only the cavern remained. The rising shape took on a humanoid silhouette, but grotesquely elongated, as if stretched by centuries in confinement. It had no distinct face, only a smooth front where features should be, yet Caldwell felt it staring directly into him. The layered voice now resonated from the entire cavern, vibrating inside his thoughts rather than his ears. The being raised one narrow arm and pointed toward the pool. Caldwell's lungs tightened, his vision trembling at the edges. He understood the command, look. Against every instinct he obeyed. The black fluid cleared like parted mist, revealing scenes beneath the surface. Dozens of children chained in an underground room, eyes hollow, bodies motionless. A place he recognized. A place the Sullivan family should never have possessed. The voice murmured one final word: remember. The pool showed more than memory, it showed intent. Caldwell watched in frozen horror as the underground room filled with chained children shifted, the image twisting to reveal faint glimmers of movement, tiny pulses beneath their skin, like threads being pulled taut from within. He leaned in, unable to stop himself. The black surface shimmered again, this time revealing something else. The Sullivan patriarch standing alone in the room, not as a captor but as a supplicant. He knelt before the children, head bowed, trembling violently. Caldwell recognized the date scratched faintly into the corner of the image, 1834. The same year the records described the incident, the mass disappearance, the shutdown of the entire estate. But what he saw in the pool contradicted every official record. The children weren't victims in the way the legends suggested. Something inside them pulsed rhythmically, synchronized with the same subterranean heartbeat vibrating through the cavern. The children raised their heads in unison. Their eyes, white, empty, glowing faintly, locked onto the Sullivan patriarch. And then, with movements too fluid for the human body, they stood. Caldwell's chest tightened. He realized the children weren't being controlled. They were conduits. The Sullivan patriarch extended his trembling hands, palms up. The children moved forward, their movements unified. They pressed their palms to his temples. The pool rippled violently as light, blinding, searing, poured from the children into him. Caldwell stumbled back from the pool, breath shaking. The cavern shook with a slow rumble as the tall, elongated figure stepped closer to him, its presence heavy and cold. The voice no longer layered, it now spoke with a single unified tone, ancient but eerily calm. This is where they were remade. Caldwell tried to form words, but only a choked sound escaped. The being extended its arm toward the pool once more. And for the first time, Caldwell saw a reflection, not his own, but a version of himself with eyes pale and hollow, the same faint glow as the children in the vision. The being's tone deepened, pressing against his skull. You were chosen the moment you entered the tunnels. Caldwell stumbled backward until he struck the cavern wall. Panic surged through him. This was no exploration. No coincidence. The Sullivan story wasn't a contained event from 1834. It was a cycle, and he realized he had walked into the next phase. The being leaned closer, its featureless face inches from his own. It whispered one word that froze his blood: kneel. Caldwell's legs buckled against his will, a force gripping his mind with surgical precision. He hit the cavern floor hard, pain radiating up his knees, but even the pain felt muted, distant, as if it belonged to someone else's body. The tall being towered over him, its elongated limbs folding gracefully as it lowered itself into a half-crouch, studying him. Caldwell's breath came in short, sharp bursts. He tried to speak, to resist, but every thought was threaded with the same pulse that throbbed through the chamber. The being lifted one long finger and touched the center of Caldwell's forehead. The instant contact flooded his head with sound, voices, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, speaking in overlapping tones. Children's voices. Men. Women. Generations. All whispering the same thing: we were called. Caldwell clutched his skull, but the being's touch held him in place. The cavern darkened, shadows rising like a tide as the pool behind the being began to churn violently. The black fluid rose upward, shaping itself into strands that writhed like living thread. The being turned its head toward the pooling darkness. The strands responded, weaving themselves into figures. Small at first, child-sized, then taller, broader, forming silhouettes that flickered between solid and smoky. Caldwell recognized the outlines. They were the lost Sullivan children. But they had not died. They had not vanished. They had been absorbed, subsumed into whatever intelligence now reached for him. The being pressed harder against his forehead, and the visions intensified. Caldwell saw the first settlers bowing to the same presence, offering their own children in exchange for knowledge, visions of the future, and power beyond human comprehension. He saw those children transformed, their bodies becoming conduits for something vast and ancient beneath the earth. Caldwell screamed, the sound ripping from his throat. The being withdrew its finger, and the voices ceased abruptly. Silence hit him like a physical blow. Slowly, deliberately, the being extended its hand toward him, palm open. You may join willingly, it said, not in words but in a pressure that formed the meaning inside his mind. Or we may take you as they were taken. Caldwell stared at the hand, shaking uncontrollably. The pool's figures leaned closer, whispering in a chorus that crackled like burning leaves. He had seconds to choose. And he knew either choice would end the man he had been. Caldwell pushed himself backward along the cavern floor, scrambling away from the being's extended hand. His palms slipped on the damp stone, smearing the thin film of black residue that coated everything. The pool behind the being rippled as the shadow children emerged further, their bodies flickering with every pulse of the subterranean heartbeat. Caldwell's chest constricted, his thoughts fracturing beneath the weight of the ultimatum. The being tilted its head as though curious. And then, slowly it retracted its hand. The cavern dimmed further, the ambient red glow fading until only the faint shimmer of the pool lit the space. Caldwell forced himself upright, leaning heavily against the cavern wall. His breath steadied slightly, just enough for clarity to seep through the terror. He remembered the strangest part of the journal he found earlier, a passage suggesting the power beneath Hollow's rest required consent to fully bind itself to a host. Consent, not willing acceptance but acknowledgement of the choice. Caldwell looked up sharply. Maybe he could refuse. Maybe he could break the cycle. The being seemed to sense his realization. It rose to its full height, towering, skeletal, ancient. The cavern's heartbeat intensified. The walls pulsed with it. The pool churned angrily. Caldwell steeled himself, his voice shaking as he forced out the first word he could manage. No, the cavern reacted instantly. The floor quaked. The shadow children convulsed, their forms tearing in and out of shape. The being moved without moving. One moment across the cavern, the next beside him, its presence freezing the air around him. Its head bent low, the smooth blank face inches from his. You misunderstand, the pressure voice intoned. You refused the wrong offering. The being reached toward Caldwell's chest, not with a hand, but with a tendril of black smoke that uncoiled from its rib-like limbs. Caldwell screamed as the tendril pierced him, cold fire ripping through his mind. For a moment his vision went white, then red, then black. He felt something pulling, extracting, not his soul, not his thoughts, but the part of him that decided. The part that chose. The part that resisted. When he came back to consciousness, his body was on the floor. The being stood over him, its tendril withdrawing slowly. Caldwell tried to move. He couldn't. He tried to think. He couldn't. Not clearly. Not independently. And then he understood. It hadn't taken his life. It had taken his will. Caldwell lay paralyzed, his consciousness drifting like a lantern on dark water. He sensed his limbs, but they no longer belonged to him. The cavern's walls pulsed in slow waves, and each pulse tugged gently at the edges of his thoughts, pulling them into alignment with the thing standing over him. The shadow children circled him, their hollow eyes glowing faintly, whispering in voices too soft to distinguish. Caldwell tried to summon resistance, but the being's tendril had severed whatever internal thread bound his thoughts to his impulses. A numb, floating calm washed over him, a manufactured serenity designed to keep him compliant. The being knelt beside him, placing one elongated hand against the cavern floor. The stone beneath Caldwell softened instantly, flowing like warm wax, shaping itself around his body. He felt himself sinking, absorbed by the living rock. The pool rippled violently, its surface rising as if eager to meet him. Through the haze of his fading autonomy, Caldwell glimpsed another image forming within the pool. Elias. Alive. Running through the tunnels, lantern swinging wildly, eyes wide with terror. Mara behind him, limping but determined. Caldwell's chest seized with a faint spark, panic or hope or something between. The being's head turned toward the image, its featureless face unreadable but undoubtedly aware. The shadow children shifted, whispering louder. The being pressed its palm more firmly into the stone. The cavern responded. New tunnels began shaping themselves along the walls, shaft-like pathways forming in seconds, tunneling upward toward the settlement. Elias and Mara didn't know. They were running straight into a maze being built for them. A trap designed from intelligence older than any blueprint. Caldwell tried to shout, but only a thin exhale escaped him. The being leaned close once more. They will arrive soon, it sent into his mind. Your role is not to resist. Your role is to witness. Caldwell felt the stone tighten around him, sealing him waist deep. The pool began to rise, its black fluid spilling outward, creeping toward him with predatory patience. The spark inside him flickered again, a faint memory of himself, the man who sought truth, who sought meaning. He clung to it desperately. But the cavern heartbeat grew louder, synchronizing his pulse to its rhythm. His vision flickered. The black fluid touched his ankle. And the shadow children leaned in, whispering a single collective word into his fading consciousness. Become. The black fluid surged around Caldwell, climbing his legs, his torso, encasing him in its cold, viscous grip. His heart hammered out of sync, then slowly merged with the cavern's pulse, one beat overriding the other. His mind flickered between surrender and defiance, the remaining shred of himself battling the encroaching tide of imposed obedience. The being stood before him, towering, patient. Behind it, the pool roared upward in a spiraling column, forming a vortex that illuminated the cavern with shifting crimson and obsidian light. In the spinning darkness, faces appeared, Sullivan children, settlers, others he didn't recognize. Generations swallowed by the entity beneath Hollow's rest. All staring at him. Elias and Mara burst into the cavern at last, stumbling to a halt as they took in the monstrous sight. Mara screamed his name. Elias raised a trembling pistol, pointing it at the towering being. The entity did not react. Instead, it extended an arm toward Caldwell, as if presenting him to the intruders. Elias shouted, voice cracking, demanding Caldwell speak, move, anything. Caldwell tried. His mouth twitched. His jaw clenched. But the fluid pulled harder, dragging him into the vortex. He managed one sound, a broken whisper, run. Elias didn't run. He fired. The single shot echoed like thunder. The bullet struck the being's chest. It didn't pierce. It didn't wound. It simply dissolved into dust. The being raised one elongated finger. Elias's body lifted into the air, limbs contorted, the life crushed out of him in a silent, horrifying instant. Mara collapsed, sobbing, crawling backward. Caldwell watched helplessly, tears mixing with the rising black fluid. The vortex intensified, pulling him deeper. The being turned toward Mara, then paused. Slowly, deliberately, it lowered its arm. It didn't kill her. It let her go. And Caldwell understood why. Someone had to bring the story back. Someone had to speak the legend so the next chosen would descend. Mara fled, screaming, disappearing into the tunnel with the sound of her fading steps echoing like a doomed promise. The black fluid closed over Caldwell's head. For a moment, one impossible, lucid heartbeat, he saw everything. The cycle. The purpose. The truth beneath Hollow's rest. And then he vanished into the vortex, swallowed whole by the same force that had taken the Sullivan children. Above him, the being whispered the final verdict of the ancient order. Welcome home.